Welcome back. If you weren't here, you can't remember where we were. We just finished chapter 4. We met Mr. Bingley, Mr. Darcy, Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Bennet, Jane, Elizabeth, and the other 3 sisters. We were just catching up with Jane and Elizabeth. They were gossiping about Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley after their lovely dance party they had, where some zombies actually broke out, because this is Pride and Prejudice versus Zombies. And this is now part 2, chapter 5. Let's get into it. Within a short, though perilous walk of Longbourn, lived a family with whom the Bennets were particularly intimate. Sir William Lucas had been formerly a maker of the fine burial gowns of such stately beauty that the king had seen fit to knight him. He had made a tolerable fortune until the strange plague had rendered his services unnecessary, because they're all zombies. Few thought it would worth the expense to dress the dead in finery when they would only soil it upon crawling out of their graves. He had removed his family to a house about a mile from Meryton. Lady Lucas was a very good kind of woman, not too clever to be a valuable neighbor to Mrs. Bennet. They had several children. The eldest, I don't know what that means. Not too clever to be a valuable neighbor. But she's a good kind of woman, I guess. Whatever. The eldest of them, a sensible, intelligent young woman, about 27, was Elizabeth's intimate friend. What voice did I give her? You began the evening well, Charlotte, said Mrs. Bennet with civil self-command to Miss Lucas. You were Mr. Bingley's first choice. Yes, but he seemed to like his second better. Oh, you mean Jane, I suppose. Because he danced with her twice, and because she fought so valiantly against the unmentionables. That's what we call the zombies in this, the unmentionables. They're too disgusting to talk about. Did not I mention what I heard between him and Mr. Robinson? Mr. Robinson asking Mr. Bingley how he liked our Meryton assemblies, and whether he did not think there were many pretty women in the room, and which he thought the prettiest? And his answering immediately to the last question, "Oh, the eldest Miss Bennet, beyond a doubt." There can be 2 opinions on that point. There cannot be 2 opinions on that point. So this is just bragging about how Mr. Bingley was like, yeah, I danced with the mom twice. It was, she's, you know what I'm saying. Where was I? Cannot be. Upon my word. Well, that is very decided indeed. Mr. Darcy is not so well worth listening to as a friend as he, said Charlotte. Poor Eliza, to be called only tolerable. Eliza is Elizabeth. She's actually like the best at the weaponry. I beg you would not put it to Lizzie's head to be vexed by his ill treatment, for he is such a disagreeable man, that it would be quite a misfortune to be liked by him. Mrs. Long told me last night. Mrs. Bennet's voice failed her as at the thought of poor Mrs. Long, her skull crushed betwixt the teeth of those wretched creatures. The lady sat in silent contemplation for a few moments. Miss Bingley told me, said Jane finally. Oh, Jane's here. All right. Miss Bingley told me, said Jane finally, that he never speaks much unless among his intimate acquaintances. With them, he is remarkably agreeable. His pride, said Miss Lucas, does not offend me as much as pride often does, but because there's an excuse for it. One cannot wonder that so very fine a young man, with family, fortune, everything in his favour, should think highly of himself. If I may so express it, he has a right to be proud. That is very true, replied Elizabeth, and I could easily forgive his pride if he had not mortified mine. I dare say I would have cut his throat, had it not the unmentionables distracted me from doing so. Pride, observed Mary, who piqued herself upon the solidarity of her reflections, is a very common failing. I believe, by all that I have ever read, I am convinced that it is very common indeed. Elizabeth could not help but roll her eyes as Mary continued. Vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to an opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have the others think of us. At this point, Elizabeth let out a palpable yawn. Though she admired Mary's bravery in a battle, she had always found her a trifle dull in relaxed company. Chapter 6. How are we doing? All right. The ladies of Longbourn soon waited on those of Netherfield. Jane's pleasing manners grew on the goodwill of Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. And though the mother was found to be intolerable, the young sisters were not worth speaking to. A wish of better being acquainted with them was expressed towards the two eldest. By Jane, this attention was received with the greatest pleasure, but Elizabeth still saw superciliousness in the treatment of everybody. It was generally evident whenever they met that Mr. Bingley did admire her, and to her it was equally evident that Jane was in a way to be very much in love, but she considered with pleasure that it was not likely to be discovered by the world in general. Elizabeth mentioned this to her friend Miss Lucas. It may perhaps be pleasant, replied Charlotte, but it is sometimes a disadvantage to be so very guarded. If a woman conceals her affection with the same skill from the object of it, she may lose the opportunity of fixing him. In 9 cases out of 10, a woman had better show more affection than she feels. Bingley likes your sister undoubtedly, but he may never do more than like her, if she does not help him on. But she does help him on, as much as her nature will allow. Remember, Charlotte, she is a warrior first, and a woman second. Well, said Charlotte, I wish Jane success with all my heart, and if she were married to him tomorrow, morrow, I don't know why it's written that way, I should think that she had as good a chance of happiness as if she were to be studying his character for a 12-month, one word. Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance, and it is better to know as little as possible of the defects of the person with whom you are to pass your life. Okay. You make me laugh, Charlotte, but it is not sound. You know it is not sound, and that you would never act in this way yourself. Remember, Elizabeth, I'm not a warrior as you are. I am merely a silly girl of 27 years, and that without a husband. Occupied, whatever, Queen, you don't need a husband these days. Occupied in observing Mr. Bingley's attention to her sister, Elizabeth was far from suspecting that she was herself becoming an object of some interest in the eyes of his friend. Mr. Darcy had at first scarcely allowed her to be pretty. He had looked at her without admiration at the ball, and when they next met, he looked at her only to criticize. But no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friend that she hardly had a good feature in her face, that he begun to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes and her uncommon skill with a blade. To this discovery succeeded some others equally mortifying. Though he had detected more than one failure of perfect symmetry in her form, he was forced to acknowledge her figure to be light and pleasing, and her arms surprisingly muscular, though not so much as to diminish her femininity. He began to wish to know more of her, and as a step towards conversing with her himself, attended to her conversation with others. Oh, he's just gonna slide in with the group. That's funny. Just funny joke, by the way, Elizabeth. His doing so drew her notice. It was at Sir William's Lucas, where a large party were assembled. What does Mr. Darcy mean? She said to Charlotte. Said she to Charlotte, by listening to my conversation with Colonel Forster. That is a question which Mr. Darcy only can answer. Well, if he does it any more, I shall certainly let him know that I see what he is about. I've not yet forgiven him for insulting my honour, and may yet have his head upon my mantle. Mr. Darcy approached them soon afterwards. Elizabeth turned to him and said, Did you not think, Mr. Darcy, that I expressed myself uncommonly well just now? when I was teasing Colonel Forster to give us a ball at Meryton? With great energy, but balls are always a subject which make a lady energetic. That's my voice for Mr. Darcy. I can do better. I'll do better. I'll find something. Mr. Darcy. I don't know. Well, he sounds like a hoity-toity guy, so he's gonna be like, I don't know, stuffy, stuffed up, full of himself. Mr. Darcy. Hello, I'm Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy has entered the room. There we go. Yeah, I like it. It's okay. It's a little low, but yeah. Well, with great energy, but balls are always a subject which make a lady energetic. It depends on who's throwing them, Mr. Darcy. Well, said Miss Lucas, her face suddenly flushed, I am going to open the instrument, Eliza, and you know what follows. You are a very strange creature by way of friend. I don't know who sang this. Always wanting me to play and sing before anybody and everybody. Oh, this is Elizabeth. Okay. You are a very strange creature by way of friend. Always wanting me to play and sing before anybody and everybody. Elizabeth's performance was pleasing, though by no means capital. After a song or two, she was eagerly succeeded at the instrument by her sister Mary, who, at the end of a long concerto, joined eagerly in dancing with her young sisters, some of the Lucases, and 2 or 3 officers at one end of the room. Mr. Darcy stood near them in silent indignation, with such a mood of passing the event to the exclusion of all conversation, and was too much engrossed by his thoughts to perceive that Sir William Lucas stood beside him, till Sir William thus began. What a charming amusement for young people this is, Mr. Darcy. Certainly, sir. And it has the advantage of also being in vogue amongst the less polished societies of the world. Every savage can dance. Why, I imagine even zombies could do it, with some degree of success. Sir William only smiled, not sure how to converse with so rude a gentleman. He was much relieved at the sight of Elizabeth approaching. My dear Eliza, why are you not dancing? Mr. Darcy, you must allow me to present to you this young lady to you as a very desirable partner. You cannot refuse to dance, I'm sure, when so much beauty is before you. He took Miss Bennet's hand and presented it to Mr. Darcy, who was not unwilling to receive it, but she instantly drew it back, and said with some discomposure to Sir William, Indeed, sir, I have not the least intention of dancing. I entreat you not to suppose that I moved this way in order to beg for a partner. Yeah, she's like, I'm just here for a drink, whatever. Like, I don't need to dance with no man. What do we got? We got time. Mr. Darcy, with grave propriety, requested the honor of her hand, but in vain. Elizabeth was determined. She looked archly, and turned away. Her resistance had not injured her with Mr. Darcy, for indeed he was thinking of her with some complacency, when thus accosted by Miss Bingley. I can guess the subject of your reverie. I should imagine not. You are considering how insupportable it would be to pass many evenings in this manner, the insipidity, the noise, the nothingness, and yet the self-importance of all those people. What would I give to hear your strictures on them? Your conjecture is totally wrong, I assure you. My mind was more agreeably engaged. I have been meditating on the very great pleasure which a fine pair of eyes in the face of a pretty woman can bestow. Oh, a pair of fine eyes. Miss Bingley immediately fixed her eyes on his face, and desired he would tell her what the lady had the credit of inspiring such reflections. Mr. Darcy replied, Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Miss Elizabeth Bennet, replied Miss Bingley. Defender of Longbourn, heroine of Hertfordshire, I am all astonishment. You will have a charming mother-in-law, indeed, and, of course, the two of you would fell many an unmentionable with your combined proficiency in the deadly arts. He listened to her with perfect indifference, while she chose to uncertain herself in this manner, and as his composure convinced her that all was safe, Her wit flowed long. Chapter 7. Oh, hang on. Oh my goodness. Cool. Okay. Chapter 7. Sorry about that. I was just catching up on myself. Anyways, Mr. Bennet's property consisted almost entirely of an estate. Chapter 7. Mr. Bennet's propriety consisted almost entirely in an estate of 2,000 a year, which unfortunately for his daughters was entailed in default of heirs male on a distant relation, and unfortunately for all was surrounded on all sides by high ground, making it troublesome to defend. Their mother's fortune, though ample for their situation in life, could but ill supply the deficiency of his. Her father had been an attorney in Meryton, and had left her £4,000. Okay. She had a sister married to Mr. Phillips, who had been a clerk to their father and succeeded him in the business, and a brother settled in London, where he had earned his letters in science, and where he now owned a pair of factories dedicated to the war effort. The village of Longbourn was only 1 mile from Meryton, a most convenient distance for the young ladies, who were usually tempted with thither 3 or 4 times a week, despite the unmentionables which frequently beset travellers along the road, to pay their duty to their aunt and to a milliner's shop just over the way. The 2 youngest of the family, Catherine and Lydia, were particularly frequent in those attentions. Their minds were particularly The 2 youngest of the family, Catherine and Lydia, were particularly frequent in these attentions. Their minds were more vacant than their sisters', and when nothing better offered, a walk to Meryton was necessary to amuse their morning hours and occasionally practice their skills. At present, indeed, they were well supplied both with news and happiness by the recent arrival of a militia regiment in the neighbourhood. It was to remain the whole winter resting coffins from the hardened earth and setting fire to them. Meryton was to be the headquarters. Their visits to Mrs. Phillips were now productive of the most interesting intelligence. Every day added something to their knowledge of their officers' names and connections, and fresh news from the battlefields of Derbyshire, Cornwall, and Essex, where the fighting was at its fiercest. They could talk of nothing but officers, and Mr. Bingley's large fortune, the mention of which gave animation to their mother, was worthless in the eyes of when opposed to the regimentals of an ensign, and the excited manner in which he spoke of beheading the stricken with a single touch of his sword. After listening one morning to their effusions on the subject, Mr. Bennet coolly observed, "From all that I can collect by your manner of talking, you must be 2 of the silliest girls in the country. I have suspected it some time, but I am now convinced." "I am astonished, my dear," said Mrs. Bennet, "that you should be so ready to think of your own children silly." "If my children silly, I must hope to be always sensible of it." "Yes, but as it happens, they are all of them very clever. You forget how quickly they became proficient in those oriental tricks you insisted on bestowing them. Being practised enough to kill a few of the sorry stricken does not make them sensible, particularly when their skills are most often applied for the amusement of handsome officers." "Mamma," cried Lydia, "my aunt says that Colonel Forster and Captain Carter do not go so often to Miss Watson's as they did when they first came. She sees them now very often burning the crypts in Shepherd's Hill Cemetery." Oh, that's pretty dark. Mrs. Bennet was prevented replying by the entrance of a footman with a note for Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield, and the servant waited for an answer. "Well, Jane, who's it from? What's it about?" "It is from Miss Bingley," said Jane, and then read it aloud. "My dear friend, if you are not so compassionate as to dine to-day with Louisa and me, we shall be in danger of hating each other for the rest of our lives. For a whole day's tete-a-tete between the two women can never end without a quarrel. Come as soon as you can on receipt of this, provided the road is free of the unmentionable menace. My brother and the gentleman are to dine with the officers. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley. Dining out, said Mrs. Bennet. This is very unlucky, given the troubles on the road to Netherfield. Can I have the carriage? Said Jane. No, my dear. You'd better go on horseback, because it seems likely to rain, and they spring so easily from the wet earth. It should prefer you have speed at your disposal. Besides, if it rains, you must stay all night. That would be a good scheme, said Elizabeth, if you were sure that they would not offer to send her home. I had so much rather go in coach, said Jane, clearly troubled by the thought of riding alone. But, my dear, your father cannot spare the horses, I'm sure. They are wanted in the farm, Mr. Bennet, are they not? They are wanted in the farm much oftener, is that a word? I didn't know that was a word. Much oftener than I can get them, and too many slaughtered upon the road already. Oh, jeez. All right. Jane, therefore, obliged to go on horseback, and her mother attended her to the door with many cheerful prognostics of a bad day. Her hopes were answered. Jane had not been gone for long before it rained hard, and the soft ground gave way to the scores of disagreeable creatures, still clad with their tattered finery, but possessing none of the good breeding that had served them so well in life. Her sisters were uneasy for her, but her mother was delighted. The rain continued the whole evening without intermission. Jane certainly could not come back. Oh, this was a lucky idea of mine indeed, said Mrs. Bennet, more than once, as if the credit of making it rain were all her own. Till the next morning, however, she was not aware of all the felicity of her contrivance. Breakfast was scarcely over when a servant from Netherfield brought the following note for Elizabeth. Uh-oh. My dearest Lizzie, I find myself very unwell this morning, which, I suppose, is to be imputed to my being set upon several freshly unearthed unmentionables during my ride to the Netherfield. My kind friends will not hear of my returning till I am better. They insist also on seeing Mr. Jones. They insist on my seeing Mr. Jones. Therefore, do not be alarmed if you should hear of his having been to me. And, excepting a few bruises and a minor stab wound, there is not much the matter with me. Yours, etc. Oh, just a mere stab wound. Oh, ouch. Just a tiny little stab wound. Alright, we'll finish this chapter, and then... we're almost there. Alrighty. Well, my dear, said Mr. Bennet. Well, my dear, said Mr. Bennet, when Elizabeth had read the note aloud. If your daughter should die, or were succumb to the strange plague, it would be a comfort to know that it was all in pursuit of Mr. Bingley, and under your orders. Oh, I am not afraid of her dying. People do not die of cuts and bruises. She will be taken good care of. Elizabeth, feeling really anxious, was determined to go to her, though the carriage was not to be had, and she was no horsewoman. Walking was her only alternative. She declared her resolution. How can you be so silly, cried her mother, as to think of such a thing, with so many of them about, and in all this dirt? You will not be fit to be seen when you get there, assuming you make it alive. You forget that I am a student of Pei Lo of Shaolin, mother. Besides, for every unmentionable one meets upon the road, one meets 3 soldiers, and I shall be back by dinner. We will go as far as Meryton with you, said Catherine and Lydia, as Elizabeth accepted their company and set off together, armed only with their ankle daggers. What? That's it? It's like nighttime, and it's like raining out. Why are they just going with ankle daggers? And we just got a note. How did we get a note so fast? I mean, feels like. Oh no, it's the next day. That's right. Never mind, isn't it? Hang on. If it is, let me know. I don't remember. I know I just read it, but whatever. We will go as far as Meryton with you, said Catherine and Lydia. Elizabeth accepted the company, and they set off together, armed only with their ankle daggers. Muskets and katana swords were a more effective means of protecting oneself, but they were considered unladylike, and having no saddle in which to conceal them, the three sisters yielded to modesty. Well, I guess I could have just read and gotten my answer, but modesty, really? Girl, they're zombies. I don't care how much modesty you have. Stab that fucker right in the head. If we make haste, said Lydia, as they walked cautiously along, perhaps we may see something of Captain Carter before he goes. In Meryton they parted. The two youngest repaired to the lodgings of one of the officers' wives, and Elizabeth continued her walk alone, crossing field after field at quick pace, jumping over stiles and springing over puddles. During this impatient activity, a bootlace came undone. Not wanting to appear unkempt upon her arrival at Netherfield, she knelt down to tie it. There was suddenly a terrible shriek, not unlike that which hogs make while being butchered. Elizabeth knew at once what it was, and reached for her ankle dagger most expeditiously. She turned, blade at the ready, and was met with the regrettable visage of three unmentionables, their arms outstretched and mouths agape. The closest seemed freshly dead, his burial suit not yet discolored, and his eyes not yet dust. He lumbered towards Elizabeth at an impressive pace, and when he was but an arm's length from her, she plunged the dagger into his chest and pulled it skyward. The blade continued upward, cutting through his neck and face until it burst to the very top of his skull. He fell to the ground and was still. Oh my gosh. Look, there's a picture of him. Can you see it? I'm not going to show you the rest, but there's a picture of him. Ooh. I'll show you the rest as it happens. The second unmentionable was a lady, and much longer dead than her companion. She rushed at Elizabeth, her clawed fingers swaying clumsily about. Elizabeth lifted her skirt, disregarding modesty, and delivered a swift kick to the creature's head, which exploded in a cloud of brittle skin and bone. She too fell and was no more. Okay, well, I guess we can show you the rest, because, wow. Look at that. Oh, boy. Anyways. Swift kick to the creature's head, and it exploded in a cloud of brittle skin and bone. That's good imagery. Very, very good. The third was unusually tall, and though long dead, still possessed a great deal of strength and quickness. Elizabeth had not yet recovered from her kick when the creature seized her arm and forced the dagger from it. She pulled free before he could get his teeth on her, and took the crane position. Oh yeah, the Shaolin style, which she mentioned earlier, which she thought appropriate for the opponent of such height. The creature advanced, and Elizabeth landed a devastating chop across his thighs. The limbs broke off, and the unmentionable fell to the ground helpless. She retrieved her dagger and beheaded the last of her opponents, lifting its head by the hair and letting her battle cry be known for a mile in every direction. Wow. Okay. That's pretty insane. That's pretty brutal, if you ask me. Elizabeth found herself at last within a few view of the house, with weary ankles, dirty stockings, and a face glowing with the warmth of exercise. She was shown into the breakfast parlor, where all but Jane were assembled, and where her appearance created a great deal of surprise. That she should have walked 3 miles with so many unmentionables about in such dirty weather and by herself was almost incredible to Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and Elizabeth was convinced that they held her in contempt for it. She was received, however, very politely by them, and in their brothers' manners there was something better than politeness. There was a good humor and kindness. Mr. Darcy said very little, and Mr. Hurst said nothing at all. The former was divided between admiration of the brilliance which exercise had given to her complexion. The former, Mr. Darcy, was divided between admiration of the brilliance which exercise had given to her complexion, and doubt as to the occasions justifying her to take the great risk of coming alone, with nothing but a dagger between her and death. The latter was thinking only of his breakfast, Mr. Hurst. Her inquiries after her sister were not very favorably answered. Miss Bennet had slept ill, and though up, was very feverish and not well enough to leave her room. Elizabeth attended her, silently worrying that her beloved sister had caught the strange plague. Oh gosh. Is Jane going to turn into a zombie? Okay, we're reaching the end. When breakfast was over, they were joined by the sisters, and Elizabeth began to like them herself, when she saw how much affection and solicitude they showed for Jane. The apothecary came, and having examined his patient, said, much to the relief of all, that she had caught not the strange plague, but a violent cold, no doubt from doing battle in the rain. When the clock struck 3, Elizabeth felt that she must go. Miss Bingley offered her the carriage. When Jane testified such concern in parting with her, Miss Bingley was obliged to convert her offer to an invitation to remain at Netherfield for the present. Elizabeth most thankfully consented, and a servant was dispatched to Longbourn to acquaint the family with her stay and bring a back of supply of clothes at Elizabeth's request, her favorite musket. And, at Elizabeth's request, her favorite musket. Well, that gets us to chapter 8. I mean, we're making way. It's not that long of a book. I think we can do this before Halloween, right? I don't know. It seems like there's a lot of characters in here, and I'm kind of lost, to be honest, with who's who and where's who. But, you know, I get, like, who's the main people we're following and stuff. It's just, I think, like, the mothers I'm getting a little confused with. But, whatever. I'm excited to see what happens more. I mean, yeah, thank you, and see you next time.